So in terms of the new frontiers and new directions, I hope I can give you this, I can let you walk away from this symposium with the impression that there's at least one new area, new frontier that is doing research on China using archaeological data. I know many people get scared whenever they hear the word archaeology or archaeological. I hope I can change that impression. You can say that if I can handle it, so can you, or everyone else, including Professor Xu as well. But just in way of background, many of us did not realize what wealth of data there is about China's prehistorical time periods, because about 5 years ago when at one of our summer school programs for quantitative history, one of the participants, Yu Xiao, was presenting something about structure of walled cities in prehistoric China. So I was very intrigued, so I asked him whether there's any database anybody has collected based on all the archaeological reports done by archaeologists. He said no. But on the other hand, he also told me that the last 30 or 40 years, especially over the last 20-some years, as the different infrastructure booms have been going on in China. First, the highway boom, and then the high-speed rail boom, and then the real estate boom that is still going on, and so many infrastructure projects. So many of those projects accidentally uncovered a lot of archaeological sites. So this is why over the last 3 decades, China has surpassed every other country in terms of the number of archaeological discoveries. So this is why our database collection effort has included in our database more than 100,000 archaeological sites with various aspects and a lot of detailed information included in this. I have to say that earlier Professor Mulan was mentioning the past did not announce the future, right? I will show you that actually China's past of 5,000 years ago did announce the future of 5,000 years later. It's just that we did not hear it, right? We did not pay attention to that announcement. So let me just as a way of introduction, a lot of German scholars in the 19th century made very bold statements, especially this one, Hegel. Chinese history is essentially historyless. It is just a repetition of the overthrow of the monarch. No progress can be produced from it. So in other words, he basically makes the point, China's history is that it has no history. Okay. The present today is also the past many thousand years ago. But I have to say, as a philosopher, he did not really have any data to back up his plan. So I will do some of his the work he should have done. And then Skinner, it's actually pretty interesting. Skinner is one of the famous historians who has proposed also big theories. But in some ways, his explanation of the claim by Hegel, even though Skinner does not say it this way, is that, okay, yeah, the Chinese history has no history. It's mainly because, Chinese history has been characterized by repeated cycles of economic development followed by a decline and then again, okay. But nonetheless, he points out what I would consider to be very more interesting characterization by him, that is, northern China followed this Kaifeng style northern development model, whereas southern China, especially the coastal line, followed this Hangzhou or Suzhou style southeastern model of development. But more recently, there's a lot of work done by our friends and colleagues trying to understand why events of many centuries ago have continued to have impact on what is happening today across China. And, one paper by my colleagues, Chen Qin and James Kong, and then Chi Chen. But the next one is me, okay, with Ma Zhichen and then Andrew Sinclair in the back. But let me go back to what I really want to talk about today as a way to reconfirm the predictions or statements by people like Hegel and others. So if we look at these two maps, this is where I would say we can see that announcement made by the past, some 5,000 years ago, about the future of 5,000 years later was not heard by anyone, but that announcement has been there. So the left of this screen shows a map of the 126 walled cities. So we can view all those walled cities, walled settlements, as relatively high population density societies that represented the most developed regions 5,000 years ago. So this period covered here goes from 3000 BCE to about 2000 BCE. So over that 1,000-year period, 128 relatively developed walled cities emerged. But one thing you can notice is that all those 128 cities of the most modern, the best development as of the time, they lie along the Yangtze River and above. So basically, in a general sense, all those early development took place in northern China, but nothing in the south. So south of the Yangtze River, no walled city as of between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. But if you look at the geographical or the spatial distribution of early development 5,000 to 4,000 years ago on the left, and then compare that spatial distribution with one of the recent sort of spatial representation of regional development in China. So on the right, you see the nightlight density of each region in 2010. If we do it today, it will be very similar. So the bright spots, the bright areas represent high development, high population density, higher income areas, and then the darker regions represent darkness or lack of development, so to speak. So you see a lot of similarity between these two maps, even though the two maps are about 5,000 years apart, right? The one big difference is really the coastal line. So the maritime trade development was the only thing in Chinese history that really broke the patterns of development from 5,000 years ago. No other major changes in terms of the spatial distribution of development. And then in order to really emphasize that until the Tang Dynasty or even the Song Dynasty period, much of the actions in Chinese prehistory and early history really took place in the north. I'm going to show that not because of the nomadic war threats, but for intra Greater China warfare. Okay, the north was much better developed, not just in terms of higher population density, higher income, but also in terms of intellectual capital and also political human capital development. So here we show the birthplaces. On the left, we show the birthplaces of the founders of major schools of thought during the Eastern Zhou period, during the Spring and Autumn period, and then Warring States period between 770 and 221 BCE, right before the First Empire was established. So you can see that all the early philosophers from the Warring States and the Spring and Autumn periods were from the north. North of the Yangtze River or along the Yangtze River. And then even when we look at the poets, where they were born, during the Tang Dynasty, because we, as children of Chinese families, we all had to learn, remember, memorize a lot of the Tang poems and song essays. So with only a few exceptions. Of course, you could say that maybe by the Tang Dynasty, finally the South had some life, some development. Of course, a few spots here, well, where is that? That's Guangdong and Hunan. But anyway, most of the other ones still lie in the north. And then as another sort of way to show how late the development of China was concentrated in the north, not so much in the south. So here we show the spatial distribution of the top 30 biggest cities in China at different times. So as of the year 2 CE, you see the top 30 cities were all in northern China, especially around Shandong and then Henan and maybe at the northern part of today's Jiangsu province. So by the middle Tang Dynasty, then there was some shift westward to Chengdu, but more importantly to the region around the Yangtze River Delta. And then by the northern Song Dynasty, then the development, or the 30 largest cities were much more spread out. And then, of course, after the northern Song, then during the Ming Dynasty as of 1580, and then the mid-Qing Dynasty, 1776, the top 30 cities, the spatial distribution stagnated, more or less, just like towards the end of the Northern Song Dynasty. But during the PRC period, mainly because of the last 40 years of reform and so on, now you see by 2021, 2 years ago, the top 30 cities now are much more spread all across China. Okay, but here the main takeaway, I would say, is really to keep in mind that at least until the Tang Dynasty, much of the action of development, in China was in the north, not so much in the south. How far back in prehistory can we really go to trace the roots of China? We use this criteria to determine when early China really started. So we use the developmental landscape for any later time, let's say 2010 or 1851 during the mid-19th century. And then go back to see until when would we not see any correlation anymore between the developmental landscape of some past prehistoric time period and later historical periods. So in other words, we want to go back to see when we no longer see the past announces the future, okay? So this is what we try to do. Archaeologists have not done this, so I think we're the first one to actually propose this criterion as a more objective way to see when early China, I know for economists and modern historians, nobody really cares. When did early China really start? For archaeologists, this is the big question. When did early China first emerge? So we try to help them. Okay, so here is one way to find out. Then the next question is, what made northern China develop first for so many millennia? Okay, so why did Chinese civilization first emerge in northern China, but not in the south? And then lastly, what are the channels through which prehistoric development has persisted for so many millennia? So let me try to do it relatively quickly so that I can cover all three questions. So first, regarding the persistence of Neolithic development in China. So here, we want to use population density as a proxy for developing the level, for measuring the level of development of each region. Okay, so this is commonly done by economic historians. And then we use the 1820 administrative zoning. We use the 269 prefectures across China as the basis. And then for the mid-Neolithic, late Neolithic, and Shashangzhou periods, because there's no historian work to estimate the population of each region 7,000 to 5,000 years ago for the mid-Neolithic, and then for the late Neolithic and so on, no such estimates. So instead, we have to rely on archaeological discoveries. So we use the number of archaeological sites divided by the area in terms of square kilometers of each prefecture as a proxy for the population density of each region during each of the different prehistoric times, okay? And then some of you may wonder how good this proxy really is. This chart should be very reassuring to us. So for this chart, the horizontal axis stands for the archaeological site density during the Han Dynasty period. Okay, so the Han Dynasty started in 206 BCE and ended in 220 CE, okay? And then the vertical axis is the population density based on Ge Jianxiong's estimates for the year 2 CE, okay? So you can see that the two variables are highly positively correlated. Actually, the correlation, the R square, when we run this simple regression, the R square is 51.6%. So what this chart shows us is this assurance that using archaeological site density to proxy for population density, of course, it's not 100% correlation, but it's very acceptable, especially when we talk about the mid-Neolithic and late Neolithic times that existed between 7,000 and 4,000 years ago. And then, as I said earlier, we want to use the developmental landscape as represented by the population density or archaeological site density, first for the late Neolithic period, or the Longshan period, between 3,000 and 1,700 BCE, to calculate the raw correlation between the population density 5,000 to 3,700 years ago and the population density during the Shashangzhou period, for example, here, then the correlation is 54%. Okay, so in other words, those high population density regions, 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, remained, at least with 54% correlation, remained high population or more developed regions. Okay, and then this correlation gradually declines as we move to later periods. So you can see that by 1851, just right after the first Opium War, so this correlation is still 28%. So which means, if you run a simple prediction, 5,000 years ago, there was an announcement about what was to come, roughly around the year 1851. Well, that announcement would have a pretty good high accuracy level of something like 28%. Okay, so I know a correlation of 28% is not considered to be super high, but we're talking about the developmental landscape 5,000 years ago and the developmental landscape 150 years ago. And then, of course, statisticians and econometricians sometimes use rank correlation. So the raw correlation may be too optimistic in the sense that, some archaeological sites should have been discovered, but not yet. So there's a lot of selection error involved. So the rank correlation may be less dependent on the completeness and the accuracy of all the archaeological sites. So out of the 269 prefectures, we rank 269 prefectures according to their population density level. Okay. Then we all only care about the rank, relative rank, rather than the absolute level. So in this case, then, the correlation levels are all respectively higher. This should be the case, because this captures more the notion that the most developed region 5,000 years ago on China's landmass, probably should still remain the top most developed region 5,000 years later, even though the exact population level may differ somewhat in terms of who would really have the, anyway, you got the point. Let me show you this next chart, which may be more intuitive, okay. So there are three sets of charts, okay. So this first set, the two lines, reflect the raw correlation, that's the bottom line, and then the rank correlation levels in terms of the correlation between the mid-Neolithic period developmental landscape. So the mid-Neolithic, remember, starts from 7,000 years ago and ends at 5,000 years ago. So in other words, we use the developmental landscape between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago as the basis to predict what was to come at each of the later time periods. So in other words, if we think that the developmental landscape 7,000 to 5,000 years ago did not change at all, then we should see a flat line of 100%. So whatever happened, of course, when we talk like that, right, here behind this statement there is this assumption that, well, we can, as Professor Xu would get excited about the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty and then Qing Dynasty. If the correlations for all the three sets would stay at 100%, that would tell us it doesn't really matter whether there was a Tang Dynasty or Song Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, and so on, because, hey, nothing changed. The name maybe it's changed from Tang to Song and Ming, but in reality, as far as the developmental landscape is concerned, no change. But on the other hand, what I want to draw your attention to is, okay, the first two lines drop relatively fast. So by the Tang Dynasty, the correlation goes down to about 40%. And then by 1102, the correlation drops below 20%. Okay, so in other words, if we want to make the claim that early China started some 7,000 years ago, probably that claim does not have a lot of statistical support, because using the developmental landscape 7,000 years ago, then we cannot explain that much. All the developmental landscapes after the Tang Dynasty, especially after the Northern Song Dynasty, because it drops down very fast. But if we use the late Neolithic as the benchmark, so this goes again from 5,000 years ago to about 4,000 years ago, the two red lines, then they don't drop down towards zero as fast, especially before the 20th century. These two correlations stayed at somewhere between 20% and 40% for much longer. Okay, so this is why we say, based on the correlations, probably the mid-Neolithic period did not establish a prototype of what we later call China. So I don't want to say at that time it was called China, because otherwise Professor Xu would give me troubles. By the late Neolithic, then things were looking pretty good. Of course, some of you may say, well, simple correlations don't really tell us that much, because it's possible that some regions anyway were so much better for humanity to live in them, so they should have higher population and so on. So we control for a host of many things, especially if we control for agricultural productivity, as represented by these indicators, as well as prefectural fixed effects and terrain ruggedness and so on. And then run regressions with respect to each past period, the mid-Neolithic period, and then we use the late Neolithic period to predict, to exactly predict all the later periods, population densities of each region. So what I want to show you is that statistical significance in using the population density of the late Neolithic to predict each of the historical time points' population density. The statistical significance remains very high with 3 stars, very significant at the 1% level, all the way up to 1851. So, when we saw this set of results here, at least I was so happy. I was like, wow. Because after 1851, the statistical significance really drops to insignificant. What that means is, all the way until the modernization movement after the Opium War, China was almost exactly like what Hegel was saying. There's no history. Chinese history did not have any history because it did not really change that much. There were changes, but hey, we can at least use the developmental landscape 5,000 years ago to still have pretty good predictability of what was to come in all the subsequent almost 5 millennia up to 1821. So this is why the introduction of Western technologies and Western institutions and many other things really introduced this force to fundamentally change the structure of the Chinese society. So anyway, so here is a quick summary. So early China did not start before 3000 BCE. So if in some ways, accidentally, this supports more or less the official claim that the Chinese civilization started maybe about 5,000 years ago. I mean, before this research, I did not believe that statement so much. But after seeing all the numbers and doing the calculations, then I became somewhat more convinced that there is something to that story, especially if we look at the next question. What drove the emergence of Chinese civilization in northern China? By civilization, we mean a collection of cultural, social, and organizational innovations that collectively establish law and order to make the society less subject to violence of any kind. Okay, so here, according to Durant, he calls a civilization. This is how he defines civilization. So civilization begins where chaos and insecurity end. In particular, there are many different hypotheses that have been proposed by scholars trying to explain what gave rise to civilizational development across different societies. But here, let's focus on China. At least there are the following 4 explanations. Hydraulic civilizations by Wittfogel. So many of you heard about the 大禹治水. Yu was the one who founded the Xia dynasty in order to fight against flooding and manage irrigation more properly. But here, I should point out, civilization and the emergence of the state as a polity, these are 2 different things. A civilization can emerge without having a political state. Okay, so in particular here, I want to emphasize that the political states arose in human societies, or like in China, several millennia later than the emergence of early civilizations. So this is why in this definition, I want to emphasize that the establishment of law and order, that's the key defining element of what we mean by civilization, not necessarily a large political organization staying at the top of a society. And then war made the state, and the state made war. Of course, Charles Tilly is famous for making this claim based on medieval European experience. But Turkin and his co-authors, they showed actually, military technology, advances in military technology and war threats together were more directly responsible for the emergence of large empires and so on. And then recently, a group of economists make the claim that perishability of domesticated crops was the major driver for the emergence of a civilized order for a given society. The main logic is that, if the domesticated crops were easily perishable after a few days, then you would not need to develop complicated rules and governing systems to establish property rights and property boundaries, contractual rules, and so on. But on the other hand, if they domesticated crops like rice, wheat, and so on, can be stored for over years after they are dried, then whether your property, your stored rice and wheat, millet, is secure or not in terms of whether someone can come in to take it away after killing your tribe or killing your family and so on, then it becomes a totally different challenge. So how can you establish law and order? Okay, so here is some of the main arguments by Louis Mumford to link the emergence of walled cities to the emergence of civilization. Okay, so according to Mumford, the wall was both a physical rampart for defense and a spiritual boundary of even greater significance, for it preserved those within from the chaos and formless evil that encompassed them. Okay, so once you have a wall forcing a lot of people to live within a very tiny space like Hong Kong, then many unintended things would emerge. That is, the city, almost from its earliest emergence, brought with it the expectation of intensified struggle within. Okay, 1,000 little wars were fought in the marketplace, in the law courts, in the ball game, or the arena. Okay, so in other words, maybe at the beginning, the formation of walls, defensive walls and moats, was to protect the people within from attacks by others from nearby tribes and so on. But once you have all the people living within day after day, year after year, then you better have some structure of governance, some administrative rules, so that law and order can actually be established, so that the people living within would not just keep fighting with each other. So this is why here the demand for some civilized order to emerge would arise unintentionally as a result of the fortification of a settlement. So this gives rise to the next. So by putting power in some measure at the service of justice, the city brought order more swiftly into its internal affairs. So this is how the link between fortification that leads to the creation of a walled city and the emergence of a civilized order. So a high degree of law and order achieved by complex Neolithic societies is a testimonial to the civilizing power of the city. Okay, let me show you two examples of early walled cities in China. So 6 days ago, I was at this place called Chentoshan. It's in Changde in Hunan that once wanted to be independent. Okay, so this walled city was there between 5,000 and 3,500 BCE. So between 7,000 and 5,500 years ago. Okay, it's not that big. So 180,000 square meters in size. But look at the structure. Okay, so there's a wall encircling the living space. Outside of this wall was this Puchenhe, the moat. It's very real. So there are several, so this is one city gate here, and then there's another one on this side, and then two gates that could only be accessed by either swimming across the moat or using a little boat. But this city, for this city, the defensive wall typically is 5 meters wide and 2.5 meters tall. So I took a picture of the moat, and then on this inside is the wall. It's actually very impressive. I mean, just remember, 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, China was still in the Neolithic age. No metallic tools were available or invented, not even invented, right? So only stone tools were used to do the digging and then construct the city wall. But of course, that wall city was too small, and then the social complexity level was not so high, partly because life was still too simple to demand very high complexity with a lot of hierarchies between the king, the ruler, and the bureaucrats, and then the commoners, and so on. But a more impressive example from the Chinese Neolithic period is Taosi. This is a walled city that's pretty large, with 2.8 square kilometers in size. This existed between 4,600 and 4,000 years ago. So in the southeastern corner of today's Shanxi province. But this city is much more complex. You can see, like, this is the palace area. So archaeologists have excavated 6 palaces here. And then next to it is this area, the living quarter area for the mid to higher class aristocrats. And then on the other side is the residential area for commoners. And then the specialization level and also division of labor were already very high. So here the storage area for granaries, and then here is the handicraft production area, and then this is where some of the cemetery areas are here anyway. So with that kind of high population density and large space with social hierarchies, then you need a lot of enforcement mechanisms and so on. So now let's see how we can actually answer the question I raised. Why did the Chinese civilization arise first in northern China but not in the south? So here now we divide China's landmass into 1,004 grid cells of 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers in area. And then we use the number of walled cities within each cell as the main variable to be explained. So in other words, if an area has a lot of walled cities, then very likely it contributed. That area has contributed a lot to the emergence of the Chinese civilization. And then the explanatory variables are listed here. So let me use this slide to explain what our hypothesis really says. So for the Neolithic period, as well as the early historical period of China, geography, terrain geography, especially terrain ruggedness, is a very significant determinant. So here, our hypothesis goes like this. Flatter terrains in northern China made these places easier to attack and harder to defend. So this feature leads to more walls for flatter regions. Of course, if indeed the flatter regions have more walls, so that would early on force the residents, the locals, to build defensive walls and moats, or moats, as a way to defend themselves. On the other hand, for mountainous regions, then they have the opposite, they face the opposite. That is, mountainous regions are much harder to attack and much easier to defend because they can rely on natural barriers as protection instead of having to do the hard work to dig out a lot of mud and construct the defensive city walls. So here, the different green colors and blue colors stand for the ruggedness level, okay? So the lighter green regions are flat, and the dark blue regions are very, very mountainous. The in-between regions are in between in terms of ruggedness level. And then the yellow circles stand for the number of walled cities during this whole Neolithic period between 8,000 and 1,700 BCE. So you can notice that for the entire Neolithic period, between 10,000 years ago and 3,700 years ago, all the walled cities lie along the Yangtze River and north of it, okay, none in the south. In particular, you can see that even though not all the walled cities were constructed on flat lands, but most of them by far either were on the flat plains or on very lightly rocked regions. Not many were constructed in mountainous areas. And then during the Eastern Zhou period, because there were many more walled cities, much more civilizational development and so on. And even now in the south, some walled cities started to emerge, but most of the walled cities were still in northern China. So now first we get this impression there is a high connection, high link between ruggedness level and the density of walled cities in the cells, okay? But our main task is to identify the channel, because geography by itself would not necessarily create walled cities and so on. Something else would have to be happening in those flatter regions so that the local residents would be forced or pressured to proactively protect themselves by constructing city walls. Okay, I guess I should just say that, believe me, okay, we have the results. We have the results with very high statistical significance. But this table mostly just shows that even after controlling for the threats from the nomads and the irrigation needs and so on, still the flatter regions significantly predict more walled cities because they need more protection and so on. But still, establishing such correlations does not necessarily give us the causality conclusion. So how can we show that somehow it's related to war? So in other words, earlier I said, flatter terrains would make wars more likely to happen and harder to defend, which would force the local residents to construct artificial barriers for defensive purposes. But for the Neolithic period, we don't have war data for the regions. So this is where our creativity comes in. So we use the archaeological data on excavated burial objects. In particular, we use military burial objects excavated from the different graves and tombs as a proxy. So we calculate the number of military grave objects that have been excavated for each cell so far that came from the Neolithic period according to archaeologists' estimates. We use that as a proxy for the war threats the Neolithic people were experiencing during the time. The logic is very simple, okay? For any of us to care so much about weapons that we want to carry the weapons into our graves, literally, right? When we are alive, we must face war threats a lot. Otherwise, I would rather bring some precious stones and production tools, right? So here is what the spatial distribution of the military grave goods look like. So for the Neolithic period, so far there are some military grave goods that have been excavated from graves from the Neolithic time, okay, in the south. But most of the weapons that were in the graves existed in northern China, along the Yangtze River and north of it. And then for the Eastern Zhou period, you can see that now in the south, maybe because of the influence from the bad northerners, the southern people now also started to put military weapons in their graves, but still most of the excavated weapons from graves come from northern China. And then actually this next chart shows for the Eastern Zhou period between 770 and 221 BCE. So now we have historical war data based on the work by historians. So here we have two different variables being illustrated. So the red circles stand for the number of military grave goods for each cell. The square yellow and square red colors stand for the number of wars that have been estimated to be the case by historians for the Eastern Zhou period. So what you can see is that there is a high overlap of wars that have been recorded to be along the Yangtze River and north of it. And then those war-ridden regions not only lie in the north, they also are accompanied with more military grave goods. Okay. So here, when we relate the number of wars for each cell to the number of walled cities for the same cell during the Eastern Zhou period, you see that the big yellow circles, which stands for the number of walled cities, typically coincide with more dense red cells. So which means the high war frequency regions also have more walled cities built. So this is why we conduct fancy causality or channel test using both the Neolithic period data and the Eastern Zhou period data via a two-stage regression exercise. Okay, so anyway, so now I have to say, believe me, it's good. Okay, so let me jump to the last table. Okay, so here in this table, we want to address several different hypotheses together to see which hypothesis would be insignificant, would not be supported, would be rejected by the data, which hypothesis would be accepted. So the wall channel dominates and captures the effect of geography. So here we have the terrain ruggedness for each region together with the number of walls for each region in the regression together. So before the wall variable is included, ruggedness used to be very significant as well as for different subsamples. So indeed, the wall channel dominates and captures the effect of geography. So in other words, it's not flat lands per se that would give rise to walled cities and the early cradles of Chinese civilization. Rather, is those flat lands where more wars happened that forced the local residents at the time to build more walls, which would lead to civilizational development. So then what about the nomadic threats from the steppe? Actually, so here, this variable has some significance sometimes, but not all the time. So it's by this time of the Eastern Zhou period, then the threats from the north became somewhat more on the minds of the elites at the time, but not too much. Okay, but the irrigation potential here, okay, in order to prove whether the 大禹治水 has any credibility or not. Okay, you see significance for this variable with 2 stars, but the sign is always negative. So in other words, regions that needed more irrigation administration actually had fewer walled cities built. According to the 大禹治水 and the Wittfogel hypothesis, we should see a positive sign here. Okay, instead we see the opposite. Actually, for the steppe distance, the distance to the steppe, for that variable, for the Neolithic period, it has the same problem. That variable has the opposite sign, a positive sign instead of a negative sign. Anyway, but the main takeaway from this part of this exercise is that northern China developed first because of war threats. That's also the reason for the Chinese civilization to first emerge in northern China, whereas in the south, the mountains became a very convenient defense against enemy attacks. So the southerners, the southern barbarians, did not need to form complicated administrative structure to have someone to be the king, to be the ruler. Everyone would be just fine living in a flat society way, not having to subject themselves to some ruler. So this is why also in another research project we show that southern China today do not have much of an aspiration to be a powerful official or to be the king or ruler, and also they would not bother to be ruled by others because, hey, especially for Hong Kong people and Cantonese and Fujianese, as long as they can make some money, then that's all they want, right? But that cultural preference goes back to the Neolithic time in the sense that, Northerners faced a lot of war threats, but the people living in mountainous areas would not have to be so threatened so frequently. So as a result, any kind of pro-power, pro-political organization culture really did not have much of a base in the South. But in the North, life was much more complicated and was not secure, so they had to. Anyway, so let me just stop here.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
As a traditional historian, so I'm very always excited to hear the very scientific history, right? Especially from the economist or from Ziwu's perspective.
So now you see why they gave us 74 million to support our quantitative history project. Right?
But one thing I have to basically have to mention that many years ago in the United States, there are some quantitative historians try to have a spin on the South history. Then unfortunately, it was discredited later on. But in last 20 or 30 years, many historians now basically start to pay attention to digital history, digital humanities. Now Ziwu is doing the quantitative history. Peter Bo and his team members at Harvard with Fudan is doing historic GIS. Of course, last year you invite Wang Yuhua of Harvard give a talk about how to use big data to basically to see what happened in China between strong leaders and weak states. Then I think maybe you know that Hutter DeWitt in Europe is doing also the digital history. So that's really very exciting new directions, give us new perspectives. So that's basically just really have a high actually note for this conference. So let me stop here. But one thing, but I'm very conservative historian. Have to say something because Ziwu's talk is about archaeological data, but archaeology discovery, by the way, so far seems very accidental. But give you two examples. One, in 1899, the folks discovered the oracle bones by accident. Then in 1974, the farmers dig up the first emperor's tomb by mistake, right? So now basically, maybe one day, archaeologists can discover something. It totally change our perception of what is China, what is Chineseness, right? So that part is not scientific, but we cannot have a high technology to say where is buried evidence, right? So let me stop here, open the floor. So, Professor.
Okay, let me just respond to your last point very quickly, because this is very important. Even though, I mean, first of all, if the accidental discoveries are all purely random, right, then we are fine.
Okay.
So because anyway, anyone who has taken statistics courses will know that if it's really random, that's like the perfect way to find out what is really hidden. And then secondly, fortunately and unfortunately, almost every piece of land that can be used for something on the Chinese landmass has been developed, has been touched. So that makes it difficult for many of the big archaeological sites to remain hidden. Of course, there are still some that are hidden, but Anyway, so
but
that should give us some comfort. And then lastly, because we all know, official historical documents are subject to selection biases. Right? So this is why, after having looked at the spatial distributions of archaeological data and so on, actually I have become more confident about the objectivity of archaeological data than about the objectivity of historical official documents-based data. So this is why it's great. So the Chinese government has spent a lot of money on archaeological discoveries.
But we have not proved the existence of Xia dynasty, right? Based on
I don't think that will ever be proved because the written word, there was no written word invented yet. So I don't know. Maybe some large scale state must have emerged around 4,000 years ago. Okay, but whether that was called Xia or something else, I think that question will remain a question for probably forever, I think.
Yeah, thank you for this excellent presentation. So I have a question, because the results that you come to resemble very much what James Scott in his book, and Oscar reminded me, The Art of Being Governed, also, of course, argues when he compares the highlands and people in the highlands and the political structures. I mean, of course, you give it a lot more history in regard to China, but do you see any other difference, or?
James Scott, of course, he's not like a digital historian or let alone quantitative historian. But I think his observations are mostly correct. Of course, most of his work is based on the experience of Mesopotamia. Actually, from our work and James Scott's and others' work based on the Mesopotamian experience, there's a lot of similarity, actually. Because for Mesopotamia, all the earliest walled cities also emerged on flat lands, and then for defensive purposes. So there is a lot of that similarity. But I guess, I don't know, at least to my knowledge right now, there's no similar study used in Mesopotamian data. So maybe somebody needs to collect a very comprehensive archaeological database for that region as well. Yeah.
All right,
Two comments. One is it's actually consistent, it's not contradicting what we try to say, because you're looking at conflict having impact on the number of war cities, where our dependent variable is the unification, number of larger states, where the nomad steppes matter, whereas I think in your case, nomad steppe did not matter that much. So that was one. The second point that was very interesting, I actually very much like Zhao Dingxing's argument, the whole Witt-Fogel idea of irrigation, the sequence is the reverse. First, you have a conflict. Once you build a conflict, you build irrigation, because irrigation supports, the military or whatever. So in that sense, it might be, I think your data might support that you actually can run irrigation against conflict. And rather the other way around. It's not because you build irrigation, you have bureaucracy. But you have military, you have bureaucracy, then you go and monitor the irrigation.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we have several different projects going on, all based on the different archaeological data. Lin Zhang is here and Shen Hao. Yeah, we're trying to answer some other questions based on the same large Chinese archaeological database. So this is why this building is an exciting place for this kind of research. So we'll gain more insights on what really happened in prehistoric China.
When I hear about conflicts, flat areas, and the geopolitical guy that I am, I think about food security and water security as being sort of the big issues here. And I'm wondering whether in your archaeological data, it's possible to understand, where maybe develop a kind of agrarian picture and a water supply picture through the archaeological data, or if there's any other sources that will kind of understand this development from the food security, water security angle. Thanks.
Thank you, Al. Well, for the periods we are looking at, especially for the Neolithic period, today's Chinese landmass had probably fewer than 1 million people on it. So the population density overall was so low. So water security, water supply issue was probably not really that big, especially, like in some of the places that really lie on flat lands, or water supply was not an issue at all, because most of them, anyway, were formed along valleys of major rivers and some small rivers. So getting water was not really a problem. Yeah, but okay. Yeah, thank you.
All right, with that optimistic note, let's thank Professor Chen Ziwu again for a wonderful conversation.
Sorry for the delay.
Thank you all for being here.